when 68-year-old Helen Carter was evicted from her apartment and found herself with nowhere to sleep. She discovered something most people had forgotten existed: a vintage phone booth on a quiet street corner that still had a door that locked. For 3 desperate nights, Helen slept standing up in that cramped glass box, hoping nobody would notice. But on the 4th night, while leaning against the back panel trying to get comfortable, she felt something give way. The panel swung open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. What Helen found at the bottom of that ladder wasn't just an underground bunker. It was a fully operational Cold War command center that had been abandoned for 40 years, containing documents that would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about a crisis that nearly ended the world. Stay until the end, because what Helen discovered in that bunker is still classified by 3 governments. Helen Carter had been a nurse for 45 years before arthritis forced her into early retirement. Her pension was small, barely enough to cover rent and food. When her landlord sold the building and the new owner doubled the rent, Helen couldn't afford to stay. At 68, with no family and limited options, she found herself on the street with 2 suitcases and $200 to her name. She spent the first 2 nights on park benches, but security guards kept moving her along. The homeless shelters were full, with waiting lists weeks long. Helen was exhausted, frightened, and running out of ideas when she walked past something she hadn't really noticed in years: an old phone booth. Not the modern kind, but a genuine 1970s phone booth with glass walls, a folding door, and a phone inside that probably hadn't worked in decades. It stood on the corner of 5th and Morrison, a relic that nobody had bothered to remove. Helen looked at it with new eyes. It had a door that closed, walls, a roof. That night, after the streets emptied, Helen slipped inside the phone booth with her suitcases. The door folded shut. It was cramped. She couldn't sit down, but she could lean against the back panel and doze standing up. It wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter, and nobody could see her clearly through the scratched, dirty glass. She made it through that night, and the next, and the next. Helen developed a routine. She'd arrive after midnight when the streets were empty, slip inside, and leave before dawn. During the day, she'd spend time in the library, applying for jobs online, trying to find any way out of her situation. On the 4th night, Helen was more exhausted than usual. She'd walked 12 miles trying to find work. Her legs ached. She leaned heavily against the back panel of the phone booth, shifting her weight, trying to find any position that didn't hurt. That's when she felt it move. The panel shifted slightly under her weight. Helen froze. She pressed against it again, more deliberately. There was definitely give there, like the panel wasn't properly secured. She ran her fingers along the edges and felt a small indentation, almost like a handle, but recessed into the metal. Helen pulled. The panel swung open smoothly, silently, revealing darkness behind it. She pulled out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and peered inside. A ladder. Metal rungs descending into a shaft that went down at least 20 feet based on where her light faded. Helen's heart pounded. What was this? Some kind of utility access? A forgotten maintenance shaft? She should close the panel and forget about it. But the night was cold, and she was so tired of standing. She made a decision that would change everything. She grabbed her suitcases, set them on the ladder's top rungs, and began climbing down. The shaft was narrow, but well maintained. No rust on the rungs, no water dripping from above. After about 25 feet, Helen's feet touched solid floor. She shone her light around and gasped. She was standing in a corridor. Not a sewer tunnel or utility passage. An actual corridor with smooth concrete walls, fluorescent light fixtures in the ceiling, and doors leading off to different rooms. And at the end of the corridor was a heavy metal door with a wheel lock, like something from a submarine. Helen walked forward slowly. She tried the first door she passed. It opened into a small room with bunk beds, all neatly made. The next room had more bunks. The third room was a kitchen with stainless steel appliances and shelves stocked with canned goods that looked decades old. She reached the heavy door at the end and turned the wheel. It spun easily, well-oiled. The door swung open, and Helen stepped into a large room that took her breath away. It was a command center, rows of desks with old computer terminals, maps covering the walls, filing cabinets, communication equipment. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but otherwise pristine, as if the people working here had simply walked out one day and never returned. Helen walked between the desks, her footsteps echoing. On one desk was a calendar, the page turned to October 1983. 40 years ago, on the wall was a large map of the world with colored pins stuck in various locations, and on a chalkboard was writing that made Helen's blood run cold. DEFCON 2, authorization code required for launch protocol. This wasn't just any bunker, this was a military installation. A Cold War command post that had been abandoned and forgotten. If this discovery is shocking you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Stories like this need to be told, and your support means everything. Helen spent that night exploring the bunker. There were sleeping quarters for what looked like 20 people. A medical bay with supplies still sealed in packages. A radio room with equipment that looked impossibly complex. And everywhere, documents. Binders full of protocols, reports, communication logs. In what appeared to be the commander's office, Helen found a safe. It was unlocked. Whoever left last hadn't bothered to secure it. Inside were folders marked Top Secret and Classified Eyes Only. Helen knew she shouldn't read them, but she did. The documents detailed something called Operation Nightfall, a backup command structure designed to maintain nuclear launch capability in case the main command centers were compromised. This bunker had been one of 12 secret installations across the country, each capable of independently authorizing a nuclear response during the Cold War. But there was more. Helen found communication logs from October 1983, specifically October 25th, 27. Those dates meant something. She vaguely remembered from history class. Wasn't there some kind of crisis in 1983? The logs detailed a 48-hour period when the bunker had been on full alert. Soviet submarines had been detected unusually close to the coast. There had been a miscommunication, a false alarm that nearly triggered a nuclear response. The crew in this bunker had received preliminary launch orders, had gone through the authentication protocols, had been seconds away from turning the keys. Then the order was countermanded. The crisis was averted. The world never knew how close it had come to nuclear war that October night in 1983. But here was the part that made Helen's hands shake as she read. The official records claimed no American installation had received launch orders during that crisis. The government had always maintained it was a minor incident, quickly resolved, no danger of escalation. These documents proved that was a lie. Launch protocols had been initiated, keys had been prepared, the world had been seconds from ending, and the public had never been told. Helen spent 3 days living in that bunker. It had power, a backup generator that still ran on some kind of fuel that hadn't depleted. It had water from an underground well. It even had food, though she didn't trust anything that old. But it was warm, dry, and safe. More comfortable than anywhere she'd been in weeks. She read through as many documents as she could. Operation Nightfall had been decommissioned in 1985 after the Cold War tensions eased. The bunkers were supposed to be sealed and their contents archived. But apparently, this one had simply been forgotten. The phone booth entrance had been intentionally designed as a covert access point. Who would ever suspect a phone booth was the entrance to a military installation? Helen knew she had to report this. The documents she'd found were historically significant. But she also knew that once she did, she'd lose her shelter. The military would seal the bunker, classify everything, and she'd be back on the street. She struggled with that decision for 2 days. Then she found something that made the choice for her. In a filing cabinet in the communications room, Helen discovered personnel files. Names of the men and women who'd staffed this bunker during the Cold War. Most were routine. Service records, commendations, transfer orders. But one file stopped her cold. Lieutenant Commander James Carter. Her husband's name. Helen's husband had died 30 years ago. He'd been in the Navy, but she'd always thought he'd served on submarines. He'd never mentioned anything about a secret bunker, about Operation Nightfall, about nearly launching nuclear weapons. She opened his file with trembling hands. Inside were his service records, his security clearance documents, and a letter. A letter addressed to My Dearest Helen. It was dated November 1983, 1 month after the crisis. James wrote, "My darling, I can never tell you what happened last month. I can never tell you how close we came. I can never tell you that I stood in a bunker beneath the city we call home and prepared to turn a key that would have ended everything. I can never tell you that I carry that weight every day. But I can tell you that I love you and that every moment I have with you is a gift I nearly destroyed. If anything ever happens to me, if you ever discover this place, know that I spent my service trying to prevent the very thing I was trained to do. Know that I chose peace, even when ordered to prepare for war." Helen sat on the cold concrete floor and cried. Her husband had worked in this bunker, had stood in this very room, had carried secrets he could never share. And now, 40 years later, she'd stumbled into his hidden life entirely by chance. She made her decision. She called a number she'd found online for the Department of Defense Historical Archives. She explained that she'd discovered what appeared to be an abandoned Cold War installation and provided the location. Within 6 hours, military personnel arrived. They secured the site, escorted Helen out, and began the process of documenting everything. She gave them her husband's name, showed them the letter, and explained how she'd found the place. A week later, a woman in a military uniform visited Helen at the shelter where she'd finally gotten a bed. The woman introduced herself as Major Sarah Williams from the Defense Intelligence Agency. "Ms. Carter, the bunker you discovered has been classified for 40 years. Officially, it doesn't exist and never did. However, the historical materials you found are significant. After review, we've decided to declassify certain elements of Operation Nightfall for inclusion in the National Archives." "And my husband's letter?" Helen asked. "That's yours to keep. It was personal correspondence, not classified material. Your husband was a good man. He served with honor during an incredibly tense period." Major Williams handed Helen an envelope. "The Department of Defense has a protocol for civilians who discover classified materials and report them properly. There's a finder's fee, compensation for your cooperation and discretion. It's not a fortune, but it should help." Inside the envelope was a check for $50,000. Helen stared at it, unable to speak. "Additionally," Major Williams continued, "your husband's full service record has been reviewed. He's being posthumously awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal for his role in de-escalating the 1983 incident. There will be a ceremony if you'd like to attend." 3 months later, Helen stood in a small Pentagon ceremony room as they awarded her husband a medal for service she'd never known about. Other families were there too, wives, children, siblings of the men and women who'd staffed the secret bunkers during the Cold War, all of them learning for the first time what their loved ones had done. With the money from the Defense Department, Helen found an apartment. Not fancy, but safe and warm. She also did something else. She wrote a book about her husband's letter, about the secret bunkers, about the night the world almost ended. The government approved it after heavy redactions, but enough remained to tell the story. The book was titled The Phone Booth Secret: Love Letters from the Cold War. It became a modest success, enough that Helen's financial worries ended. But more than that, it told the story of ordinary people who'd served in extraordinary circumstances, who'd carried unbearable secrets, who'd made split-second decisions that saved millions of lives. The phone booth on 5th and Morrison was removed by the military. The bunker was sealed properly this time, but before they closed it forever, they allowed Helen one last visit. She stood in the command center where her husband had once worked and placed a single rose on the desk in the commander's office. "Thank you for choosing peace," she whispered. "Thank you for carrying that weight so we didn't have to." Today, Helen is 70. She volunteers at veterans organizations, helping families research their loved ones' service records. She speaks at schools about the Cold War, about the people who served in silence, about how close we came to the edge. And sometimes, when she walks past where the phone booth used to be, she stops and remembers. A desperate night, a hidden door, a ladder into darkness. How losing everything led her to discover her husband's greatest secret. How homelessness brought her closer to him than she'd been in the 30 years since his death. If Helen's story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who needs to know that even in our darkest moments, we can discover light. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in that bunker? Thank you for watching, and remember that sometimes our lowest points lead us to discoveries we were always meant to find. Sometimes a phone booth is more than shelter, and sometimes the secrets we uncover help us understand the people we thought we knew.